Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome back to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through the Norman dynasty, a remarkable bloodline that transformed England forever from 1066 to 1154. In Part 1, we'll softly explore the conquering reign of William the Conqueror and the flamboyant rule of William Rufus, from the momentous Battle of Hastings that changed English history to the mysterious hunting accident that would shake the realm, all while witnessing how Norman culture reshaped medieval Britain. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which Norman conquest interests you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 11th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. William, later known as William the Conqueror, entered this world at Falaise in the Normandy territory of northern France, sometime between 1027 and 1028. The chronicle De Obitu Wilhelmi, meaning concerning the death of William, composed in the late 11th century to honor William's passing in 1087, recorded that he had reached 59 years when death claimed him. Should this prove accurate, William's birth must have occurred between the 10th of September 1027 and the 9th of September 1028. Similar to numerous other aristocrats of the High Middle Ages, William's lineage did not employ a family name, and, since his epithet of the Conqueror was earned much later, we must consider him throughout the initial 4 decades of his existence as simply William of Normandy. His father was Robert of Normandy, who in 1027, around the period of William's birth, had risen to the role of Duke of Normandy, sovereign of the vast Duchy of Normandy in northwestern France, which commanded the valley of the river Seine as it coursed outward from Paris toward the English Channel. His mother was a woman called Herleva, whose exact origins remain uncertain. One account suggests she served as a domestic in the ducal household at Falaise, while alternative versions propose she was the daughter of a merchant from the settlement. One of William's contemporary biographers has theorized she was a daughter of one of the chief ministers to the Dukes of Normandy. However, although Herleva's heritage remains unclear, there exists no question that her relationship with Robert of Normandy occurred outside the bounds of matrimony or church recognition. Consequently, William was not a legitimate heir, and although he would inherit his father's position, he was nonetheless regularly called throughout his existence as bastardus, or the bastard in reference to his illegitimate status. The Duchy of Normandy into which William was born and which he would eventually govern was a relatively recent dukedom or region in France. Its foundations lay in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. William's great-great-great-grandfather was Hrolfr Ragnvaldsson, a Viking who in the late 9th century commanded a large Viking force that executed several raids into the northern portion of the Frankish kingdom in what is now France. However, unlike numerous other Viking warbands that simply pillaged territories and departed, by the 870s, Hrolfr and his Viking followers had established themselves in the lower Seine River Valley, from where they could extract tribute from Paris and cultivate the fertile farmland of the Normandy region. This arrangement persisted until the early 10th century, when eventually the French monarch, Charles III, in 911, chose to accept Hrolfr as one of his own vassals, rather than continue being harassed by these Viking warriors. Thus, in 911, Hrolfr became the first Count of Normandy, and he altered his name to that which he is most commonly recognized by today. He styled himself Rollo, and in time, his descendants would adopt the title of Dukes of Normandy. He was also baptized, initiating the process whereby these Norse settlers in northern France converted to Christianity throughout the 10th century. Thus, William was born into a Norse family, but one which had rapidly become Gallicized. For instance, they embraced the languages and customs of their new homeland, speaking French and Latin, and employing laws which were partially Germanic and partially derived from the civil law of the Romans, as it was transmitted to the Frankish kingdom. However, they brought some of their own traditions to the region as well. Consequently, this was soon recognized to be a distinctive culture which was present in northwest France, one which would have an enormous influence on Europe during the High Middle Ages. The people here were called the Normans, and their customs were Norman customs. The word derives from the term for Normandy, the land they inhabited, which essentially means the land of the Northmen, in acknowledgement of the Normans' origins in Scandinavia. William's youth is relatively obscure compared with our extensive knowledge of his later existence. He evidently received some form of literary instruction, but the details are vague, other than a fragment of information which reveals that a mysterious Ralph the monk was involved. By the time he was merely 7 or 8 years old, the Duke's young son was already being included in ceremonial events concerning the feudal administration of Normandy. For instance, when some of Robert's feudal lords paid tribute to him, William was present at these ceremonies in acknowledgement of the fact that their loyalty would transfer to him one day when Robert died and William succeeded him. One had to mature quickly as a potential lord in 11th century Europe. Easily, the most devastating and momentous event in William's young existence occurred in 1035, when he was either 7 or 8 years old. The boy would have been aware, even at this tender age, of his father's extended absence from Falaise. In 1034, he had undertaken a pilgrimage to visit Jerusalem in the Holy Land. However, on the journey home, he became ill and died at Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, on the 2nd of July, 1035. When word of his death reached Normandy, the young William, as Robert's only son, though illegitimate, was now proclaimed Duke of Normandy. Rumours which emerged at the time that Duke Robert had been poisoned in Anatolia are almost certainly false, and his sudden illness and death could have been due to any wide range of maladies which were barely understood at the time. William's rule during his minority was chaotic. Already during Robert's reign, there had been a number of overly powerful lords exercising too much independence from the ducal court at Falaise, and with an 8-year-old boy now the Duke of Normandy, these tendencies only became greater. Consequently, William's guardians spent much of the 1030s and early 1040s trying to re-establish ducal authority. The situation even declined to the extent that William had to be moved around the Normandy region for his safety. Despite these early challenges, William was able to assume the rule of Normandy in his own right upon turning 15, most likely in 1042. It is from this date that major chroniclers of William's life, such as William of Jumièges and William of Poitiers, began to describe him as being at the center of events occurring in Normandy. For instance, William's first active military success is described as being the capture of Falaise from a recalcitrant local lord named Thurston Goz. This occurred early in 1043, when William was probably 15 years of age. Thereafter, in the years ahead, he succeeded in re-establishing ducal authority throughout northwest France, aided to a great extent by the King of France, Henri I. The most significant moment in this stabilizing of his rule in Normandy came in the early summer of 1047, when William was on the cusp of entering his 20s. At this time, he managed to see off a serious challenge to his legitimacy when his cousin, Guy of Brion, claimed the duchy for himself. William eventually defeated Guy at the Battle of Valais-Dunes, near Caen in Normandy, following which he imposed a truce of God on the other Norman nobles, a medieval concept which was at its height in the 11th and 12th centuries, and which called for Christian lords to swear vows of peace towards one another. Following this, William cemented his control of the region by appointing his half-brother Odo as Bishop of Bayeux in 1049, a major position in western Normandy. Throughout their accounts of these events of the 1040s, William's biographers and chroniclers, typically monks and other religious figures writing in his own day, or shortly afterwards in the late 11th and 12th centuries, were at pains to suggest that the young duke was a major driving force in the reform of the duchy and the consolidation of power in his own hands in the 1040s. However, whether these accounts were exaggerated later or not is open to some dispute. It is also from the period of the late 1040s and into the 1050s that we first hear regular mention in contemporary histories of figures such as William Fitzosborne and Roger de Montgomery as acting as William's advisors. These men would advise William for many years to come, and their appearance in the historical record at this time gives the impression that a stable and coherent government had been formed in the late 1040s. Several of these individuals would also be William's closest confidants and commanders when it came to his famous invasion of England many years later. Thus, by mid-century, William had strengthened his control over Normandy and ended the instability which had characterized the region since the early 1030s. Having done so, William's thoughts turned towards securing his line. In 1050, he married Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of Count Baldwin of Flanders in what is now southern Belgium. Baldwin was one of the most powerful rulers in northern Europe at the time, and the marriage was a major diplomatic coup for William. In time, the union would result in 4 sons: Robert, Richard, William, and Henry, and 5 daughters: Adelida, Cecilia, Matilda, Constance, and Adela. 2 of these sons would sit on the throne of England in time to come. William's career subsequent to 1050, and the events which have made him one of the major figures in English history, must be assessed in light of developments in England as far back as the 1010s. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark and ruler of the Danes, a Norse people who had been raiding Britain extensively since the 980s, conquered England and usurped the throne from King Ethelred, the head of the Wessex line of kings. Although Ethelred quickly fought back and resumed the kingship in 1014, he died in 1016, making his son, Edmund Ironside, the new king. However, Edmund was now cast into a new war with the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, Cnut, by the end of 1016. Cnut had managed to seize control of much of England from Edmund, and when the Wessex king died in November, Cnut proclaimed himself king of all England, a powerful ruler who now reigned over a North Atlantic empire stretching from England, east to Denmark, and north into Norway. He would rule until 1035 and was remembered as Nut the Great. Despite Cnut's ascendancy, the Wessex line was not wholly defeated. In 1016, Ethelred's other son and Edmund Ironside's brother Edward fled with the rest of the family across the English Channel. They found refuge at the court of the Dukes of Normandy, where they acted as kings of England in exile and were afforded many honours by William's grandfather and father in the 1020s and 1030s. Then, in the early 1040s, just as William was entering his early manhood and preparing to rule in his own right, the situation changed again in England. Canute was succeeded in 1035 by his son, Harold Harefoot, who subsequently died in 1040, only to be succeeded by another son of Canut's, Harthacnut. However, Harthacnut was a young man without an heir who was also suffering from some unspecified illness, possibly tuberculosis. Accordingly, in 1041, he made preparations for the succession should he die. His dispensation for England was that Edward, now known by the byname the Confessor, owing to his religious piety, should return from Normandy and succeed him as King of England, should he die without producing an heir. This subsequently occurred the following year. Thus, the Wessex line of kings was restored in England in 1042. Edward did not quickly forget the support he had received from the Dukes of Normandy and the honours they had been afforded in northern France throughout his and his family's long exile in the quarter of a century after 1016. Although there is substantial controversy over these events, it is very possible that in 1051, when a crisis arose in England between Edward and the powerful Anglo-Danish House of Godwin, the king promised William of Normandy that he would succeed him as King of England following his death, Edward being without a legitimate heir and largely leading a celibate life. There is substantial reason to believe that this promise was actually made in 1051. Many of our most important sources for William's life attest to it. For instance, the Gesta Wilhelmi, or Deeds of William, written by William of Poitiers around 1066, and the Gesta Normanorum Ducum, or Deeds of the Dukes of the Normans, compiled by William of Jumièges around 1070, both include this version of events. However, these could be dismissed as having been written after William had made his claim to the throne of England and conquered the country, and as such might be deemed politically biased. But there is also evidence from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a long history of England in the Middle Ages, which predates William becoming king. Recent studies have proven that the relevant sections of the Chronicle detailing Edward's promise to William were written in the 1050s or early 1060s, before William became King of England. Consequently, the author would have had no political reason to include this version of events if it was not true. There is then every reason to believe that Edward did in fact make William his heir in 1051, and that the Norman Duke's claim to the throne of England was authentic and strong as a result. Whatever the truth of these matters, their material significance for William would not become a concern for another 15 years, as Edward lived well into the 1060s. In the interim, William faced further challenges at home in Normandy. Despite his earlier alliance with Henri IV of France, William clashed with the French monarch on several occasions in the 1050s, a result of the splintered and decentralized power arrangement which predominated in France throughout the 11th century. Several invasions of Normandy were undertaken by Henri between 1053 and 1057, but when William won a substantial victory against the king and his allies at the Battle of Varaville in August 1057, the tide was turned. William now went on the offensive against Henri, and when both the king and his foremost ally, Geoffrey Count of Anjou, died in 1060, William was able to impose his power throughout northern France. In 1063, he even managed to bring the entire County of Maine, a substantial French province to the south of Normandy, under Norman rule. This brought extensive additional resources under William's control, which would aid greatly in his invasion of England a few years later. One of William's most significant building projects also dates to this time. In 1062, he and Matilda began their patronage of the construction of a new church and nunnery in the town of Caen in Normandy. The complex was originally intended to consist of two main buildings: the Abbaye aux Dames, or Women's Abbey, intended for a group of Benedictine nuns, and the Abbaye aux Hommes, or Men's Abbey, devised as a monk's abbey. Eventually, the wider complex would become known as the Abbey of Sainte Trinité, and stood throughout the late medieval and early modern periods as one of the most impressive religious establishments in northern France. However, it was not fully completed until 1130, long after both William and Matilda had died, an indication of the sheer ambition of the project. When completed, it consisted of a main church built in the Gothic style, with transepts spreading out from the back into the abbeys for the nuns and monks. These transepts were built in the early medieval Romanesque architectural style, so the church and abbeys at Caen, which William patronized, are a melding of the main architectural styles of both the early and High Middle Ages. This represents a statement of a world that, like the Duchy of Normandy, stood at the end of one period of Europe's history and the beginning of another. Having secured the southern border of Normandy, William turned his attention west in 1064 towards the Celtic Duchy of Brittany and its ruler, Conan the Saint. This resulted in the Breton-Norman War, which would last until 1066, eventually ending in something of a stalemate. It is curious for having involved Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex in England, and the head of the powerful House of Godwin. Harold had most likely been sent to France to reaffirm King Edward's earlier offer to William to succeed him as England's ruler. At this time, William made Harold swear an oath that he would accept his succession. This latter event is vividly depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-meter-long cloth tapestry produced in the 1070s, which still survives today. It depicts the events leading up to William's claim to the English throne and his subsequent invasion of England in 1066. Housed today in the Bayeux Tapestry Museum in the town of Bayeux in Normandy, northern France, it is a remarkable survival and a striking record of William's ascent to the kingship of England, or at least how he wished people to understand how he had risen to the kingship. The meeting of William and Harold in northern France in the mid-1060s was to take on a striking significance. In early 1066, King Edward the Confessor, by now in his 60s, fell into a coma late in 1065. He never fully recovered and died on the 5th of January 1066 in London. He still had no clear heir, and Edward's lack of clarity and indecision over the succession now opened a window of opportunity for Harold. The following day, on the 6th of January, the Anglo-Saxon Witan, the Assembly of Anglo-Saxon and Danish, lords and members of the ruling class of England, met and proclaimed Harold as the new King of England. The stage was now set for a major showdown with William. Within weeks, plans were underway in Normandy for William to enforce his claim as Edward's successor. Indeed, it is almost certain that William had been preparing politically and militarily for Edward's death throughout the 1060s. Hundreds of warships and transport boats were now gathered or placed under construction in the ports of northern France, and William reached out to his recently acquired subjects and allies from across northern France to aid him in his invasion. A debate has arisen in recent years as to how William actually prepared his invasion force. This was, by some standards, the largest amphibious invasion and action undertaken anywhere in Western Europe since the days of the Roman Empire. But the Romans were the dominant power of the known world at the time and capable of massive logistical operations, whereas William was the duke of a minor principality in northern France by comparison. How then, many medievalists and historians have wondered, did William prepare such an invasion force and transport it across the English Channel in such a short period of time? What historians of this subject increasingly believe is that the Norman invasion of 1066 was only made possible by the diffusion of new technologies to northern France from other parts of Europe in the course of the 11th century. For instance, William's army would have involved upwards of 3,000 warhorses. Studies have concluded that the kind of longships and galleys used in the North Atlantic during the early Middle Ages simply could not have carried these across the English Channel in anywhere near the necessary amount of time for him to have carried out his campaign in 1066. Instead, William was relying on a specific type of ship for transporting horses, the design of which had reached Normandy from the Byzantine Empire in the eastern Mediterranean in the first half of the 11th century. Thus, from a logistical point of view, the Norman invasion of 1066 and William's expedition was only possible because of the changing nature of medieval Europe in the 11th century and the increasing diffusion of knowledge and technologies around the continent. William was not the only claimant to the throne. Harold also faced a challenge from his own brother, the Earl of Northumberland, Tostig. As the Earl of a large domain in northern England and a member of the powerful House of Godwin, Tostig had his own considerable support to claim the throne. He had already been implicated in a rebellion in the north in 1065, prior to Edward's last illness and death. Now, in 1066, he clashed directly with Harold, who banished him from England. Tostig spent the spring and summer months scheming with various foreign powers in the world of the North Atlantic. He took refuge with his brother-in-law, the Count of Flanders, Baldwin V, who gave him financial and military support to raid southern England in the summer. Tostig even considered allying with William, but eventually he looked further east to Norway. At some point in the summer of 1066, he made contact with King Harald Hardrada of Norway and convinced the Norse monarch to lay his own claim to the English throne. Harald Hardrada received Tostig's petition favourably. He quickly prepared an invasion force of approximately 10,000 men and 300 ships, which landed in northern England in the early autumn. Initially, Hardrada and Tostig made good progress. A substantial victory was won against some regional forces outside the town of York at Fulford on the 20th of September 1066. But in the days that followed, Harold arrived to the north himself with his armies. The forces of the English King Harold and the Norwegian King Harold finally met at the village of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire on the 25th of September 1066. The result was a stunning victory for the English Harold. Both Hardrada and Tostig were killed in the engagement, and thousands of the Norwegians were killed or badly wounded. Such was the scale of the defeat that of the 300 ships which had conveyed the Norse army to England, only 2 to 3 dozen were needed to bring what was left of the army back to Norway. Harold had seen off the first major threat to his rule, but the greater one waited to the south, and the distraction created by the northern invasion of Hardrada was not insignificant in the campaign which followed. Having spent the summer rallying his allies and supporters in France, William's invasion force of perhaps somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 men crossed the English Channel on the night of the 27th of September, making their full landing near Pevensey in East Sussex on the morning of the 28th. The date is significant, as Harold had been making preparations in the south throughout the summer and early autumn against William's landing, but the invasion by Hardrada and Tostig in the north had drawn his forces away, allowing for a smoother landing in the south. Thus, the stage was set for the final showdown between Harold and William. Having disembarked, William moved his forces to the nearby town of Hastings in late September and early October. In the process, his forces devastated the surrounding Sussex countryside, requisitioning food supplies for the army, and also as a form of psychological warfare. No sooner had he defeated Hardrada in the north than Harold had to quickly make his way south to see off the second invasion. On the other hand, William did not advance north towards London and Harold's forces. He was content to wait and allow Harold to come to him in Sussex. His reasons were twofold. First, He had established a strong base of operations at Hastings with good supplies collected from the surrounding region. Secondly, he did not wish to sever his lines of communication with his fleet by advancing inland. Clearly, William was preparing for the possibility of an unsuccessful military engagement against Harold, and the eventuality that he might have to make a hasty retreat back across the Channel to Normandy. By the 13th of October, Harold had advanced south to near William's position at Hastings. When William received word of the king's arrival in East Sussex and his encampment to the northeast of the town, he prepared his troops and marched out from Hastings shortly after dawn on the morning of the 14th. The ensuing battle, one of the most critical in English history, has become known as the Battle of Hastings, but it did not actually take place in or next to the town of Hastings itself. Rather, the clash occurred roughly 11 kilometers to the northwest of the town, near a steep ridge in the Sussex countryside. The area is now the site of the village of Battle, named in honor of the conflict which occurred there nearly a millennium ago. The exact specifics of how the battle played out are a matter of some dispute, not least because contemporary histories and accounts tended to greatly distort events for political reasons in its aftermath. For instance, the number of troops involved is usually exaggerated to a great extent. Nevertheless, historians today are agreed on the general facts of the battle. William brought at least 7,000 men with him out of Hastings, and perhaps as many as 10,000, a large proportion being Norman heavy cavalry, the elite warriors of 11th century Europe. Harold had a similar number, but these were tired after the month of exertion in marching all the way north to Yorkshire and then returning quickly to the south, fighting the Battle of Stamford Bridge along the way. The battle commenced in the early morning at Battle and lasted all day, a long engagement for the time. Harold's forces had the advantage of the high ground, having occupied the high ridge at the site, but they were restricted by having the forest of the Weald at their back. Thus, while William's forces were disadvantaged by having to move uphill, they had greater room to move about the battlefield. In the end, 3 factors won the day. William was able to deploy his archers to pick off Harold's troops on the ridge. Secondly, his cavalry was superior to Harold's, but the most significant factor was William's generalship. Throughout the day, he used a number of feigned or pretend retreats to disrupt the English lines and strike at weak points in Harold's arrayed men. These attacks eventually reduced considerably the number of Harold's elite troops, the housecarls, in the English shield wall. These were replaced by auxiliary troops, but eventually, the barrage of feigned attacks and strikes at weaker points in the English king's shield wall proved fatal. It was during one of these feigned retreats late in the day that Harold himself was struck down and killed. With the king dead, the Anglo-Saxon and Danish forces allegedly broke. Many fled, and others surrendered. Thus, by the time the sun set on the 14th of October 1066 over the field at Battle and near the town of Hastings, Harold Godwinson was dead, and William of Normandy was one gigantic step closer to claiming the English throne. Any assessment of the Battle of Hastings does also need to bear in mind the adage that history is written by the victors. Our sources for the battle, and indeed much of the wider Norman conquest of England, come almost exclusively from Norman. Writers who are sympathetic to William are naturally critical of Harold, or from other sources such as the Bayeux Tapestry, which were unequivocally pieces of propaganda designed to extol William's victory. For instance, many sources suggest that Harold was killed late in the battle when an arrow hit him in the eye, but others suggest he died early on in the conflict. Whatever the chronology of this, nearly all contend that Harold's army began to collapse and flee once their king was killed, suggesting a disordered and poorly trained body of troops. But others still, which are less flattering of William, contend that Harold's forces actually held together quite well, even after the king was killed, and attempted to flee with his body. Others are vague about the actions of the Normans. For instance, the battle largely concluded with the Normans pursuing some of Harold's forces to a site known as Malfosse, or the Evil Ditch. Exactly where this is and what happened here is unclear, but it is probable that the Normans massacred some of the remnants of Harold's fleeing army at this site, an act remembered in the name of the place in local lore. From a military perspective, Hastings was not just the critical battle in the war for the throne of England in 1066. It also reflected the changing order in the North Atlantic world, as for nearly 300 years, the world of Scandinavia, Britain, northern France, and the Low Countries had been dominated by the military power of the Viking people. who burst out of Europe in the late 8th century with their longboats and infantry warriors. Hastings marked the triumph of Franco-Norman fighting tactics, with its mixed infantry and cavalry, over the Anglo-Saxon and Danish troops which had long dominated the North Atlantic world. In the aftermath of the battle, William did not immediately assume the English crown. This was complicated by the creation of a new king by the Lords of the Witan in London. The man chosen was Edgar Atheling, a grand-nephew of King Edward the Confessor and the grandson of King Edmund Ironside, who had briefly ruled England 50 years earlier in 1016. When news of Harold's defeat and death at Hastings reached London, in the days that followed, a decision was taken to proclaim Edgar, a boy of perhaps 13 years of age at the time, as the king. Edgar's reign would be one of the shortest in English history. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hastings, William proceeded cautiously, securing the towns of Dover, Canterbury, and Winchester before making any attempt to seize London. By this means, he secured the South and the Midlands and isolated the supporters of the puppet king in the capital. Just weeks later, as William's armies advanced towards London, the supporters of the young king made the decision not to continue the charade of pretending William could be resisted. The boy king and his supporters met with William not far from the capital in early December. Here, an agreement was reached which allowed Edgar to abdicate peacefully. This action, and the seizure of London, completed the initial Norman conquest. William of Normandy was crowned as King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. The ceremony was presided over by Aldred, the Archbishop of York, who performed it in English, before Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, a diocese in Normandy, translated Aldred's words into French, in a ceremony which indicated how a foreign people had effectively conquered England. In an ominous sign of the bloodshed which would mark much of William's reign as ruler of England, some of William's soldiers stationed outside the abbey believed William had been assassinated when they heard what were actually shouts of acclamation from within. In a panic, they began setting fire to some of the houses around Westminster. It is after this rather chaotic coronation ceremony that William ceases to be known as William of Normandy, and instead becomes William VI, or, as he is more commonly known to history, William the Conqueror. It would be incorrect to suggest that the shift which occurred in England in 1066 was limited to a few set-piece battles and a change of ruler, after which things settled down again quite quickly. England had been conquered by a foreign power, one which brought with it new ways of governing, laws, cultural mores, and even a different language. As we will see, over the next 20 years of his life, William and his Norman followers would transform England from a hybrid Anglo-Saxon and Danish land into a new Anglo-Norman kingdom. As one of the great historians of medieval England, Richard Southern, once noted, no country in Europe between the rise of the barbarian kingdoms in the 5th century and the 20th century has undergone so radical a change in so short a time as England experienced after 1066. Some of these changes were immediate. The changing order saw thousands of Anglo-Saxons and Danes who had been strong supporters of the House of Wessex, or the Danish lords flee England, either for Denmark, Norway, Scotland, or even neighbouring Ireland. Many would attempt to organise new invasions to restore the old rule of the Anglo-Saxons and Danes, but most would never return. In their place, William brought in thousands of Norman settlers from France, perhaps as many as 20,000. These medieval colonists did not enormously dilute the existing population, which is believed to have been somewhere around 2.5 million people in England by the mid-11th century, but they did place a strong body of Normans in positions of power in many of the towns and villages up and down 11th century England. Over time, these newcomers transformed English society. The most obvious and enduring sign of this was the introduction of the language of the conquerors, Anglo-Norman, a dialect of Old French with some traces of Norse in it, reflecting the Viking heritage of the Normans. Over time, much of the diction of Anglo-Norman was absorbed into English, thus fundamentally altering the language spoken in England into a hybrid of Germanic and Romance languages. This process would take centuries to fully occur. However, for the remainder of William's reign, the conquering class spoke a version of French, and the bulk of the population still spoke Old English. Thus, bilingualism would have become necessary for many working in government or as traders in London and other towns from the late 1060s onwards. Along with this lingual change, shifts in the functioning of government and the law also occurred. Law French became the language of the courts, a position it would hold legally until the 18th century. Moreover, the court system became more centralized under Norman rule, a move which helped in the development of the common law in the 2 centuries that followed. A truly positive development which followed from the Norman conquest was the gradual phasing out of slavery as a major feature of society in England. Already by the time of the Norman invasion in 1066, slavery was a far less common practice within Norman society than it was in England and Britain. The Domesday Book, which, as we will see, was compiled in the mid-1080s, 20 years after the Norman conquest, indicated that there were some 28,000 slaves officially listed in England. While such figures were doubtlessly inaccurate to some extent, given the issues in precise record-keeping during the 11th century, this was clearly a significant drop in the number of slaves which had been present in the country prior to 1066, suggesting William and his followers had manumitted or freed many slaves following the conquest. This process continued thereafter. Slavery was not banned in England, nor indeed was it in most of Europe until the 19th century, but it was gradually phased out. By the 12th century, the number of slaves in England had declined by as much as 30% from what it had been prior to 1066, and this process continued during the 12th and 13th centuries. By the late Middle Ages, slavery was considered something in England, as elsewhere in Europe, which could not be imposed on fellow Christians. Another very substantial change which William brought about was his reform of the English Church. At the time of the conquest, the Church in England was very loosely organized. William tied it much more closely together and appointed several followers to senior positions in order to impose uniformity. Lanfranc, a celebrated Benedictine monk, was made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, the same year that William's chaplain, William of Bayeux, was made Archbishop of York. Between them, the pair oversaw the creation of a centralized Anglican church, which strove to maintain its independence from the papacy in Rome on many matters, an independent streak of Anglicanism which foreshadowed many developments in the English church in years to come. But the real heart of the changes wrought throughout England in the aftermath of the Norman conquest lay in the sphere of land ownership. William had many followers who had supported him, not just in his campaign against Harold in 1066, but through several periods when he needed their military and political support in the 1040s and 1050s. England was now their bounty. We can gain an insight into just how great this land transfer was from the Domesday Book. It comprises a vast survey of land ownership in 11th century England, 2 decades after the Norman conquest, and was the most extensive account of land ownership produced for the country until the 19th century. What it reveals is the manner in which William rewarded his French and Norman followers in the aftermath of the conquest by granting them vast territories throughout the country. Leading lords and followers had enormous estates bestowed on them. These were often huge chunks of land in geographically strategic regions, which they were also expected to control in the interest of the Normans as the conquerors of this foreign land. For instance, one of William's strongest supporters, Robert de Beaumont, heir to the title of Count of Moulins in Normandy, had fought with William at Hastings. He was rewarded with over 90 manors in England in the years that followed, strategically centred around Warwickshire and Leicestershire. Thus, this leading companion of William's was to hold the English Midlands for the Norman interest and was given enormous estates in the region with which to do so in the years ahead. The new Norman stone castles, which eclipsed the wooden motte and bailey fortifications that the Danes and Anglo-Saxons had preferred in England up to that time, would have begun to appear throughout the countryside as a means of securing Norman rule here if the Anglo-Saxons and Danes should rise up. In recognition of his immense authority in the area, Robert was made the first Earl of Leicester later in his life. He was not alone in being placed in a position like this. Another senior companion of William's in 1066, William de Warenne, was granted lands in at least 13 counties by the 1080s, particularly around Sussex and Surrey. He was ennobled shortly before his death in 1088 as the first Earl of Surrey. William Fitzosborne, the Lord of Breteuil in Normandy, was a close companion of William's who was also related to the Conqueror. He was given a position of prominence in the West Midlands and March region bordering into Wales, particularly the counties of Herefordshire, Gloucestershire and Monmouthshire. Here he was given Clifford Castle, Berkeley Castle, and Monmouth Castle as imposing symbols of Norman rule, fortifications which he expanded significantly. He was also quickly made Earl of Hereford to symbolize his preeminent position in the English West Midlands. Through these measures, William and his Norman companions imposed their rule over England in the years following the conquest. This was not a benign conquest. Enormous land transfers of this kind severely uprooted people and turned England upside down. Moreover, the conquest itself in late 1066 caused severe devastation of the countryside of southern England, and it was not long before it provoked resistance. In 1067, William had returned to France to oversee his domains there. Unrest began rising as soon as he left for France. When he returned to England later that year, an extensive program of castle building had already been undertaken by William Fitz-Osbern to try to impose greater control over the regions beyond London and the home counties. Early in 1068, William campaigned into the West Country where Norman rule was being resisted. It is hard to minimize the role Fitz-Osbern played in this element of the conquest for his cousin. As well as establishing castles in the West Midlands and the March region, where he was appointed as the Conqueror's primary representative, he initiated the construction of numerous other castles in southern England on the new king's behalf. These included Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, where a fort had been built by the Romans a millennium earlier and adapted for further uses by the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings in later times. Fitz-Osbern oversaw the construction of a new castle here, which would later gain some infamy as being where King Charles I was imprisoned by Parliament in 1648, prior to his being put on trial and executed. Fitz-Osbern would have emerged as perhaps the single most important figure in England in the 1070s and 1080s, had he not eloped to the Low Countries in 1070 in an effort to establish himself as the new Count of Flanders, an ambition which resulted in his death at the Battle of Cassel in February 1071. The late 1060s saw perhaps the greatest threat to the newly established Anglo-Norman kingdom. A major rebellion broke out in Northumberland in 1069, which coalesced around the figure of Edgar Etheling, a member of the House of Wessex who had briefly been proclaimed king in London in the winter of 1066. The rebels here were also aided by contingents of Danes from Scandinavia, but all were driven north into Scotland when William campaigned against them in 1069. This was a brutal military action, with William devastating the countryside of northern England. A near-contemporary chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, who is generally regarded as an accurate chronicler and who did not sympathize with the Norman conquerors, described William as bringing, quote, famine and the sword to northern England in 1069. His description is corroborated by the evidence of the Domesday Book, which showed that land values here in the north of England were still enormously lower in the 1080s than they otherwise should have been, a sign of how much damage William and his followers inflicted on the region to suppress its independence. Further campaigns followed in 1070 in the northwest along the coastline near Chester and the March region bordering Wales. New castles were quickly erected and Norman overlords imposed their will. The last major pockets of resistance here were not finally crushed until 1071. Thus, we might consider that far from being a short military conquest in 1066, the Norman conquest was actually a long 6-year campaign in which England was subjugated by the Normans through a brutal strategy of military conquest, enforced famine, and the replacement of the Anglo-Saxon and Danish aristocracy with a new nobility of Norman knights, ruling the country from their imposing stone castles. The campaign in the north of England, or the Harrying of the North as it has become known, was at the apex of the campaign of destruction. Between 1069 and 1071, the countryside around towns and cities like York was effectively laid waste, leading to such extreme famine and migration that it is now understood that tens of thousands of people probably starved to death in northern England at this time, while in some parts of the northern counties, the population had declined by as much as 75%, even years later, a result of the methods employed by the Normans here during the conquest. Many people simply fled to Scotland and overseas in the wake of the arrival of the Normans. Thus, the Norman conquest of England was not a sanguine transfer of power from one ruler to another as a result of a battle in southern England in 1066, but an extremely bloody process which disrupted the lives of people all over England for many years. Hand in hand with this brutal policy of military subjugation, William also implemented a propaganda campaign in the late 1060s and 1070s to justify his invasion of England and the benefits of Norman rule. We have already seen that writers such as William of Poitiers and William of Jumièges were writing soon after the conquest, in ways which depicted William's career leading up to 1066, and the actions of that year in a favourable light. For instance, William of Jumièges, who was certainly a Norman monk favourable to the new king, and who must have been in his 60s by the time of the conquest, began working in the late 1060s, while England was still in the process of being pacified by the Normans on the Gesta Normanorum Ducum, meaning deeds of the Dukes of the Normans, an extremely favourable account of the Dukes of Normandy, particularly William, and his reign since the 1040s. These reverential accounts of William the Conqueror would shape the perception of him in a very positive light for centuries to come. Other efforts were more visual and symbolic. The Pope in Rome, Alexander II, ordered in 1070 that William and his followers should do penance for the sins they had committed. In killing many people during the conquest and in the months and years after, William took this as an opportunity to further glorify the conquest. The penance he undertook was to order the construction of an abbey for the religious order of the Benedictines. It was to be built on the battlefield to the northeast of Hastings, where William had effectively won the throne of England in October 1066. The altar of the church within the abbey was apparently placed at the exact location where Harold had fallen during the battle. Dedicated to St. Martin, Battle Abbey was only completed after William's death, but is a striking example of Norman propaganda in England. The abbey, as it still stands today, is dominated towards the front by two large crenellated towers between the main gatehouse and entryways. Further battlements stretch out from there, giving the impression of a defensive structure, although this was meant as a residence of the largest religious order in 11th century Europe. Elements of the abbey have either been damaged in the intervening millennium since its construction, or were moved for safekeeping at various points, such as during the English civil wars of the mid-17th century. One of these is understood to have been a triple light-stained glass window depicting St. John the Baptist and the crucifixion of Jesus. The abbey is also believed to have housed the Battle Abbey Roll, a commemorative list of the main companions who accompanied William on his expedition to England in 1066 and who fought at Hastings. While historians of medieval England generally do believe that the Battle Abbey Roll existed, it has not survived down to the present day, and instead, William's decision to commemorate his allies and companions in this way is only known to us second-hand from accounts such as Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, written in the late 16th century. More famous than Battle Abbey and the Battle Abbey Roll is the Bayeux tapestry previously mentioned. Its exact origins are not entirely clear, but it is assumed that it was commissioned either by William's wife, Matilda, or his half-brother Odo, Earl of Kent and Bishop of Bayeux. The latter theory seems the more likely, and if so, it was very likely that Odo had it commissioned to be placed in the newly built Bayeux Cathedral when it was consecrated in July 1077. Yet even if Odo did commission it, it is highly unlikely that William was not aware of the project or had not granted it his seal of approval. As a visual display of the official history of the Norman conquest, standing in Bayeux Cathedral from 1077, the tapestry would have told William's subjects in Normandy the story he wished them to believe about how he had come to be the King of England. It consists of 58 individual scenes, many of which are given Latin titles to aid the viewer's interpretation of what they are seeing. These primarily refer to events which occurred between 1064 and 1066, beginning with Harold's visit to France and his acknowledgement of William as King Edward's designated successor. As such, the scenes highlight the contested nature of the English kingship in the 2 years prior to William's invasion of England, and the tapestry concludes with his victory at Hastings. Throughout, it seeks to legitimize the conqueror's claim to the English throne, in law as a result of the events of the mid-1060s, and then to celebrate his military triumph in southern England, when he elected to press his claim through force of arms. There is a providential aspect to the narrative employed as well, with one scene featuring Halley's Comet and showing a future vision of an invasion fleet. The idea here is meant to be that William's invasion and victory were foretold by the heavens, and that the passage of the comet over England in 1066 was believed to be an omen of the favour William's cause was held in. Overall, the Bayeux Tapestry is a highly sophisticated piece of political propaganda by the standards of the 11th century, one which affirmed the just nature of William's ascent as King of England and the Norman conquest of Britain. In the aftermath of the final conquest of the country, William made clear his priorities in terms of his domains. They lay in France, and for the remainder of his life, some 15 years, he would spend approximately 4/5 of all his time in Normandy and elsewhere on the continent, only returning to England for short periods of time. Our natural inclination to think that William would have made England his home in the 1070s is based on our knowledge of England's later position as a great world power. But in the world of 11th century Europe, the real heart of William's territories lay in France, closer to the centre of Norman and French culture, which was gradually spreading out to conquer many other parts of Europe, notably much of southern Italy and Sicily. He was also needed in France, as unrest arose there in the mid-1070s and forced him into several years of military campaigning, firstly to resume control of the county of Maine in 1073, following a revolt which had broken out there during his absence in England, and then to campaign against the French, whose power was being restored under the new monarch, Philippe I. These difficulties in France were not the only ones which William faced in the 1070s. In 1070, the King of Denmark, Sweyn II, despite promises to William that he would withdraw any Danish troops from England and cease to interfere in the region, decided to personally lead an expedition across the North Sea. There he joined with a prominent Anglo-Saxon rebel who had drawn many opponents. Of the Normans to his cause, Hereward, the Wake. Hereward effectively had control over the Isle of Ely in eastern England and part of the Fens region nearby at this time, and Sweyn now brought additional troops to bear here. William was able to buy off the Danish king by paying a substantial Danegeld, the name for a tribute to the Danes from an English king which had been paid intermittently since the 9th century. But the rebellion in the Fens was not so easily suppressed, in part because the marshy terrain of the Fens was unconducive to the Normans bringing their heavy cavalry to bear against Hereward and his troops. It was only when William arrived to take personal command of the campaign here in 1071 that the stalemate was broken. A pontoon was constructed between the mainland and the island of Ely, which allowed William and his troops to storm Hereward's main stronghold here. Thereafter, several of the rebel leaders were either executed or imprisoned, while others were pardoned and effectively bought off with new grants of land to win their loyalty. Hereward may have been amongst the latter, but accounts are conflicting, and some have him fleeing into exile in Scotland after the rebellion was broken in 1071. This was not the end of William's troubles in England. In 1075, a new revolt broke out in the country, though in this instance it was not driven by Anglo-Saxon or Danish lords who were unreconciled to the Norman conquest, but rather came from amongst William's Norman subjects themselves. The origins of this lay in the marriage of Emma Fitzosborne, the daughter of William Fitzosborne, the king's great companion, whom he had made the first Earl of Hereford, but who had died in Flanders in 1071, to Ralph de Guarda, another prominent Norman lord in England, whom the Conqueror had ennobled as the Earl of East Anglia in 1069. The king had refused to sanction this marriage, but Emma and Ralph had gone ahead with it in any event while the king was in France in 1075. The real driving force behind this act of disobedience to the crown was, however, not Emma or Ralph, but Emma's brother, Roger, who had succeeded their father as the second Earl of Hereford back in 1071. In the years that followed, he had formed ambitions to carve out his own independent principality in England in the absence of the king himself, who had spent most of his time since the Norman conquest in northern France. Thus, in 1075, he married his sister to the Earl of East Anglia with a view to forming an alliance with de Guarda and launching a combined revolt against William's rule in England. The revolt of the Earls, as it is termed, was soon joined by the Earl of Northumberland, Waltheof, an Anglo-Saxon lord of northern England. The combination of three of the most powerful lords of England in revolt was a major threat to William, but the king benefited from a number of fortuitous events in the first weeks of the rebellion. First, Waltheof lost heart quickly and decided to abandon his allies, while the leaders of the English church and the southern nobility rallied to the king's cause and raised troops to prevent the southern descent of Hereford and East Anglia, while William was preparing to return to England. By the time de Guada made his move from Norwich towards Cambridge, a large royal army had been gathered to confront him, and he fled to Denmark, leaving Emma to oversee the defence of Norwich. Eventually, she negotiated terms whereby she and her new husband were allowed to retire quietly to some lands they held in Brittany, in northwestern France, in return for relinquishing their estates in England. The Earl of Hereford was not so lucky, and William had him imprisoned following the crushing of the revolt. He would remain confined for the remainder of the king's reign, while the revolt of the Earls in 1075 posed a clear threat to William's rule in England, albeit one which was easily seen off, owing to a number of fortuitous developments. The most pressing issue for William in the 1070s was a family dispute which arose between 1077 and 1080 between William and his eldest son and designated heir, Robert. William had left Robert in charge of Normandy when he had left for England in 1066, and the dispute might well have arisen as a result of disappointed hopes held by Robert that he would effectively rule the French duchy thereafter, with William living in and contenting himself with his new English domains. The conflict, though settled by 1080, foreshadowed rivalries which were to bedevil the family for years to come. War with Scotland in 1079 brought William back to England for an extended period of time in 1080 and 1081. No doubt the resulting military campaigns throughout Northumberland served to further destabilize a region which had already suffered greatly under Norman rule. It was also during this time that he travelled deep into Wales, firstly on pilgrimage to St David's in the extreme west of the country, but also as a means of imposing some sort of overlordship over the Welsh princes there, the first in a longer and intermittent process whereby English rule was established in Wales during the late Middle Ages. The final years of William's reign were in many ways an anticlimax after the heights of achievement seen in the 1060s, when the Normans had united so much of Britain and France under the rule of one man. A further conflict arose with Robert in 1084, which led to his exile from the Norman court. He would not return during William's lifetime. The mid-1080s also saw an emergency arise within England over an expected invasion of the country by a joint force of Danes and Flemish troops under the King of Denmark, Canute IV, who sought to challenge William for control of the country. Demonstrating the callousness of the Normans towards their English subjects, the new lords of the country implemented a policy of scorched earth throughout eastern England in preparation for the invasion, the idea being to deprive any army which landed of crops and other supplies to sustain themselves. In the event, the invasion never materialized, as Nut died in Denmark before it ever departed. But the Domesday Book attests to the manner in which East England was devastated by the Normans, who prized the military benefit of doing so over the damage it did to the communities who lived here. The perception of England as being a country which was militarily occupied by the Normans in the 1070s and 1080s, rather than a nation which had been liberated by the benevolent Duke of Normandy, is further cemented by William's ongoing building program in the later part of his reign. Much of this involved continuing the castle construction which had been undertaken in the late 1060s around England, but other elements were more pointed in their symbolism. For instance, in 1078, William initiated the construction of a new military fortress on the edge of the City of London, the beginning of what we now know as the Tower of London. The first building here, which today is known as the White Tower and is the most iconic part of the tower, was effectively a military compound, built overlooking London and designed to intimidate William's new subjects. The denizens of the capital had, after all, attempted to crown a new king in the shape of Edgar Etheling, rather than accept William as their monarch after his victory at Hastings in 1066. William's distrust of Londoners evidently lingered long afterwards. For centuries to come, this was the heart of the security state in England, with ordnance and weapons stored here down to modern times. William was making a statement in erecting such an imposing military complex on the outskirts of London. He was telling his new subjects in the capital of England that if they tried to support a new pretender or aided his enemies in any way, he could strike at them swiftly. The tower, dominating the skyline of the city and past which all boats entering and leaving London along the River Thames had to pass, was a statement of military power. There is also a possibility, one which is seldom commented upon in studies of William the Conqueror's reign, but which is not entirely implausible, that he was considering a military campaign west to Ireland during the latter stages of his reign. Ireland had been a bridge too far for many powers operating from France and Britain in past times. The Romans, for instance, had never tried to conquer the island, though they were familiar with what they called Hibernia and its geography and politics, while the English crown would not launch a full invasion of the Western Island for nearly 100 years after William's time, when Henry II sanctioned an expedition there in the late 1160s. However, there is evidence that William was in contact with some of the primary regional lords and rulers there in the late 1070s and early 1080s, notably the O'Briens of Thomond in Munster in the south of the country. The country was not unified, but divided into dozens of different polities, which were often at war with each other. The idea that William was considering a military expedition against this politically divided region in the last years of his life is heightened by a section in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in which it is stated that William would have conquered Ireland if he had lived for a few more years, fueling the idea that he was planning a new campaign westwards over the Irish Sea. If this was the case, it seems probable that William's goal was more to cut off any support which the Welsh and Scottish were receiving from Ireland, rather than to actually conquer the country. But in any event, it is a curious and largely forgotten footnote to William's later reign that he might have been considering such an Irish expedition. William spent Christmas 1085 at Gloucester, and it was while he was here that the Domesday Book was commissioned. This was more often called the Winchester Roll in its own day, or Liber de Wintonia, meaning the Book of Winchester, as a result of being housed at Winchester. It gradually became known as the Domesday Book from the late 12th century onwards, the reference being to doomsday in the perceived sense of the finality the book offered in its records of landholding in Anglo-Norman England. The undertaking to produce it was immense by the standards of the 11th century. William had sent crown agents and officials out to survey every shire in England and to compile lists of who owned the land in each district and how much of it, as well as their property in the form of goods and slaves. The number of such officials involved must have been considerable when we consider some of the details unearthed during the survey. For instance, Domesday records that there were 5,624 mills built in communities across England, a level of socio-economic data which is completely untypical of medieval sources. Administrative exercises of this kind were unwieldy undertakings in the Middle Ages, and it is a sign of his dedication to assessing the landholding situation of his new kingdom that William ever initiated it to begin with. It is also remarkable how speedily the commissioners and crown officials managed to carry out their work. It is likely that portions of the Domesday Book were brought to William while he toured some of southern England in 1086, but he would never have seen the finalized text in the format in which it survives today at the National Archives of the United Kingdom at Kew in London, as it was not fully finished and collected together until after his death. It is fitting that one of the final acts of William's reign was to order its compilation. The Domesday Book presented a striking picture of how the Norman conquest had transformed England and of the 1,400 or so Anglo-Saxon and Danish tenants-in-chief who had formed the upper caste of landholders in England prior to 1066. Only two were still in place in 1086 when the Domesday Book was compiled. Several thousand freemen and freewomen below these tenants-in-chief still held lands which their families had possessed prior to the conquest, but these now owed service and taxes in kind and cash to their new Norman overlords, those who had been placed throughout England, and who lived in the many stone castles which had been built in the 20 years since William of Normandy had become William the First of England. The fame of the Domesday Book and the administrative work involved evidently spread beyond England in the years that followed. Around the turn of the century, the Norman rulers of Sicily attempted a similar survey of landholding across the Italian island, inspired by what the Conqueror had undertaken in England a decade and a half earlier. It is testament to the fact that, as well as being a military leader, William was also a modernizing administrator and ruler. William left England for the last time in the autumn of 1086. He returned to France, where his enemies on that side of the Channel, including the King of France, had yet again taken advantage of his absence in England to begin attacking his possessions in Normandy and elsewhere. In 1087, he stabilized the situation and then campaigned towards Paris. It would be his last military action in a life which had consisted of nearly 50 years of warfare. In July, while undertaking a siege of the town of Mantes to the northwest of Paris, he became ill, possibly having suffered a riding accident which caused the pommel of his saddle to rip into his stomach. As a result of the injury, he was removed, back north to Normandy, first to the town of Rouen, and then to the Abbey of Saint-Gervais outside the town. It was here, on the 9th of September 1087, at about 60 years of age, that the Conqueror of England, the Norman who had united much of France and England under one ruler, finally died. In the days that followed, William's body was transported to Caen, where it was laid to rest in a tomb in the Abbey of Saint-Étienne. The succession was a more complicated matter. As early as 1063, William had designated his eldest son, Robert, as his successor as Duke of Normandy. However, the matter of the succession to the throne of England had never been fully resolved, and the falling out between William and Robert had suggested that Robert would not succeed him. Moreover, it was common practice amongst the Normans for multiple sons to split the inheritance from their father. But as the second son, Richard, had predeceased William and had died in 1081, the next eldest son was William, called William Rufus for his red beard. The arrangement now reached was that Robert would succeed to the Duchy of Normandy, as agreed in 1063, but William would succeed his father as King William II of England. The fourth son, Henry, was given very little, though he would eventually succeed William II as King of England many years later in 1100. As perhaps befitted William the Conqueror's life and the bloodshed which followed him, his sons would spend many years after 1087 at war with each other for power in the political world of northern France and England, and when Henry himself died in 1135, England was yet again thrown into civil war. Thus, for all that the Conqueror did to transform England after 1066, his immediate family could never peacefully rule the country for very long. While the decades following William's death might have witnessed a gradual decline into family feuding and quasi-civil war in England and Normandy, more broadly, his reign set the template for the history of the English state in the High and Late Middle Ages. For instance, it was William who established the English state along the lines which it would further develop into during the centuries ahead, with English developing as the spoken language, but French remaining the language of the law courts. But perhaps, more significantly, it was William who established the new Anglo-Norman state's claim to Wales and Scotland during his reign, while ultimately providing England with a continental legacy in France. This would form the backdrop of English history for the next 400 years, as successive kings sought to impose English control over Wales and Scotland with varying degrees of success, and intermittently sought to reimpose English control over significant parts of France, even in the face of the growing centralization of the French state and the Crown's increasing ability to combat the English there. Thus, William the Conqueror set the template for much of England's subsequent history through to the 15th century. William's body and tomb in death have had a turbulent history. He was laid to rest in the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, in Normandy, next to the Abbey of Sainte-Trinité, which he and his wife Matilda had patronized the construction of back in the early 1060s. The first disturbances surrounding his tomb occurred on the day of William's funeral, when a local peasant first disrupted proceedings, claiming the land that the religious buildings there had been built on was his by right. Subsequently, that day, as the Conqueror's body was being lowered into the tomb, it was discovered that the passage had been made too narrow. When they forced the body, it damaged it, and a putrefying odor was emitted. Thus, William's damaged corpse was laid to rest. It was exhumed for the first time in 1522 on the orders of Pope Adrian VI. The exact reason for doing so is unclear, but once the local French cardinal had examined the embalmed body and the tomb, he was quickly reinterred. This was, though, just the first of many exhumations during the early modern period. 40 years later, as the French Wars of Religion broke out across France in the 1560s, a mob of Calvinists in Normandy opened the tomb on the suspicion that the Roman Catholics of the town of Caen had hidden treasure or other valuables in William's tomb. Some of the remains of the Conqueror's body were known to have been damaged and destroyed at this time. What remained was reinterred eventually, but only until the early 1790s, when, following the French Revolution, a fresh mob yet again desecrated the tomb. This time, most of William's bones were thrown into the River Orne. Only a single thigh bone survived. Eventually, this was exhumed again in 1961 and more formally placed in a new tomb surmounted by a marble slab in front of the altar of the Abbé aux Hommes in Caen in 1987. It is there that what little remains of the conqueror's bones rests today. There is no doubting that William of Normandy, who became William the Conqueror, was one of the most significant figures of English history and one of the most consequential rulers of medieval Europe. Having assumed the rule of a relatively unstable duchy in northern France when he was just 7 or 8 years old, he succeeded in his young adult years in not only securing his position in Normandy, but also in browbeating the King of France and effectively conquering the County of Maine in the late 1050s and early 1060s. At the peak of his powers in France, he began in 1064 to campaign west into the Duchy of Brittany. It was at this point, when his military and political power on the continent was at its strongest, it would perhaps ever be in his lifetime, that Edward the Confessor died in England without an heir. The result was a military invasion in 1066, the Battle of Hastings that October, and William's coronation as King of England on Christmas Day. But the real conquest took 6 years and was a bloody, brutal affair which unleashed misery on many people living in England at that time. In its aftermath, William and his followers transformed England, totally in the case of landholding, and gradually in the case of its culture, with the adoption of new laws and customs, and eventually the creation of a new language in modern English, which blends the pre-conquest Germanic language of the Anglo-Saxons and the post-conquest French of the Normans. By temperament, William was by all accounts a relatively amiable character, though this surely only veiled a more ruthless, taciturn streak. He was clearly religious and founded many churches, though he had limited appreciation for the supposedly universal sovereignty of the Pope in Rome, and his governance of the church within his own dominions preempted that which Henry VIII would later attempt by nearly 500 years. He was, it appears, faithful to his wife Matilda during their long marriage, an unusual occurrence for the time. Nevertheless, he was a largely uncultured figure, one who hardly patronized the world of learning in England or France, and who pursued his political and military ambitions with a dogged single-mindedness born of a strong character. It was this single-mindedness which brought the Normans to England and transformed the country forever. William, later known as William Rufus, or King William II of England, entered this world in 1060 in the Duchy of Normandy, situated in modern-day northern France. His father was William the Conqueror, who notably defeated King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings during his invasion of England in 1066. On his paternal side, William's lineage was Norman and before that, Scandinavian, and he could trace Rollo, the renowned Viking warlord, as one of his ancestors. Unlike his son William Rufus, William the Conqueror had experienced a rather challenging upbringing as a young prince, and on more than one occasion, as a child, had needed to be concealed in the homes of the poor for his protection, as his family struggled for the supremacy of northern France against rival dynasties. Nevertheless, from 1042 onwards, when William came of age, he demonstrated himself to be a strong and ruthless leader, and was responsible for the gradual entrenchment of his rule in the Duchy of Normandy, afterwards proceeding to annex the County of Maine in 1063, and then England in 1066, which were to become his son's inheritances. William Rufus's mother was Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of Count Baldwin V of Flanders, and was by all accounts extremely petite, standing at only 4 feet in height. She had wed William in 1049 as part of an alliance that was designed to strengthen the conqueror's hold on Normandy, which had been challenged most seriously in 1047, when a group of rebellious noblemen, led by his cousin Count Guy, had sought to depose him. The Count of Flanders had proven a capable ally for William in that year, as he defeated the rebel force at the Battle of Valles Dunes, with Baldwin's support being the crucial deciding factor in his victory. There were, however, issues with the marriage, which was condemned in 1049 by the Pope for being incestuous, since William and Matilda were third cousins once removed. This violated the papal regulations on consanguinity, which decreed that the marriage of 2 people who shared more than 7 generations of relatedness should not be allowed. Despite their parents being closely related, William and his siblings were all born relatively healthy and without any disabilities or deformities, but they were all probably fairly small owing to the size of their mother. William had 3 brothers, Richard, who died sometime between 1069 and 1074 in a hunting accident. Robert Curthose, his older brother, with whom he quarrelled on and off throughout his life, and Henry, his youngest brother, a man who would always sit uncomfortably with the fact that he was the youngest son, and an opportunist who endlessly flitted between Robert and William depending on who he could get more from. William had 4 sisters: Adela, who married Stephen, Count of Blois; Cecily, who was to follow the monastic route to become the abbess of the Holy Trinity at Caen; Constance, who married Alan IV, Count of Brittany; and finally Agatha, of whom very little is known. In appearance, William was said to be a stocky man of medium height, with a protruding belly, a ruddy complexion, and eyes of indeterminate colour, which were specked with small points of light according to the chronicler William of Malmesbury. Hence he was distinguished from others of his own name with the nickname Rufus, after his reddish-brown features. William was infamous in clerical circles for styling his fair hair, which was variously described as red or blonde, unusually long, with a parting at the centre so that his forehead was on display most of the time. In fact, William was a flamboyant king who loved to dress in the latest fashions and was responsible for introducing many new styles into court, such as short tunics and pointed shoes, which were heavily criticised by monastic writers who preferred their sovereigns to be less effeminate. William was the opposite of this, and in private was able to joke around with his friends and confidants as he went about the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom. Yet in public, he struggled to be an articulate statesman, and when angry, his voice would start to stutter, adding to the common perception that he was rather graceless when addressing an audience. William Rufus was a generous man who rewarded those loyal to him well, and had the utmost respect for those who performed feats of bravery and boldness on the battlefield. Although he was a military man, he did not share the usual reserved disposition of the soldier, and was, in fact, someone who relished extravagance, once reprimanding one of his servants heavily for buying him some shoes for 1 shilling by exclaiming, "You son of a whore!" since, when has a king got to wear shoes as cheap as that? Go and buy me some for a mark of silver. William's penchant for the latest trends and fashions, and his overt disrespect for religious institutions, put him at odds with the church for most of his life, who deplored his exuberant lifestyle and indifferent attitude towards God. William was viewed as a heretic, and even worse than that, an atheist, a position which can be seen in one account in which he is recorded to have said in response to the judgment of an ecclesiastical court, "What's this? God's a just judge. Damn him, I say. Who believes that after this? I swear that from now on, matters that can be bent by any man's nod shall be brought before my court, not God's." His attackers also point to the many flowery phrases he is reported to have uttered, including "by the holy face of Lucca" and "by the mountains and the valleys," which to them illustrated he was more interested in invoking the names of idols rather than God. He was also accused of indulging in homosexuality. His detractors pointed to his many unorthodox tastes, unbefitting of a lord of his stature as evidence, including his snappy dress sense and foppish hair. However, unlike all the other accusations thrown his way, the charge that William was gay is the only one that seems to have any merit, and remains an important detail of his life that even modern historians all seem to agree on, as William died without marrying and produced no children, not even illegitimate ones. Moreover, some historians have pointed to his comrade Guillaume, Count of Poitou, who fought with William towards the end of his life and spent a lot of time with him as a possible lover. They also point to the fact that he was a great benefactor of the arts, overseeing the restoration of William the Conqueror's White Tower in London and totally revamping the Great Hall at Westminster. On the other hand, there appears to be no concrete evidence to suggest that William had any court favourites, nor were any of his companions that way inclined. In addition, his interest in the arts can hardly be pointed to as confirmation of his homosexuality. At the time of William's birth in 1060, his father, William, had successfully consolidated his authority in Normandy, thanks in large part to the stabilizing influence of his marriage with Matilda and a series of stunning triumphs. In 1057, he successfully repelled an attack by ambitious French warlords, Count Geoffroy and King Henri, who were seeking to carve out their own piece of Normandy at the Battle of Varaville, a major watershed moment in the Conqueror's career. that secured his duchy right up until the last years of his reign, when William Rufus would fight alongside him to maintain order. He was also able to win the friendship of the powerful Bishop Yves of Sèze, who switched to William's side and married the heiress of Belém to one of his henchmen, Roger de Montgomery, in one of a number of political masterstrokes which gave William the upper hand against his French rivals, now weakened by the deaths of Count Geoffroy and King Henri, whom he was preparing to attack in 1060. When William Rufus entered the world, William the Conqueror was commencing his campaigns into northern France, where he would go on to annex considerable swathes of territory, including the county of Maine in 1063, which he delegated to his oldest son, Robert. In 1065, at the same time as his father was cementing his new gains and planning his assault on England, William Rufus was entered into formal education and assigned to the household of the scholar and monk Lanfranc, who was the abbot of Caen. As the third son of William the Conqueror, William was not directly in line to the throne, and so his parents initially set him on a path towards being a cleric in the same vein as his sister Cecily. Here, William learned about Christian doctrine, how to conduct himself appropriately in a courtly manner, the morals of behavior, and about the lives of the lower servants who were bound to serve him. However, it turned out that William was entirely unsuitable for a position in the church, and it's most likely that his time spent with Lanfranc learning to be a religious man was an unhappy one, for William excelled more at military pursuits and had no interest in leading a life of devotion to God. As a boy of 12 in 1072, William would have started to learn instead about the methods and armaments of warfare, something which appealed to his sense of duty and honor, far more than the stuffiness of a Christian education. At this age, he would have learned how to ride a horse properly, how to use a bow, and how to lead men into battle, all valuable skills for a young princeling who was looking to distinguish himself as a military man like his father. William was highly competitive in military affairs, loving nothing more than riding, throwing spears, and being the first to take up arms and enter the fray, for he believed his pride would be damaged if someone did this before him. William's switch to a warrior lifestyle took on a new significance sometime between 1068 and 1074, after the tragic death of his brother Richard in a hunting accident unexpectedly promoted him to second son and into a position where he was more likely to be king in the event that his oldest brother Robert died, which would require him to be well versed in the skills of warfare and diplomacy. As a result, he was appointed as a knight's bachelor to serve by the side of his father to gain experience. To contemporaries, it was clear that William was the favorite of his father, whose alleged possessive nature only served to push away his more independently minded heir Robert, whose headstrong personality would always land him in trouble and out of favor with the Conqueror. During this period, William Rufus would have to learn very fast what it meant to be a leader as he accompanied his father on multiple military expeditions, including the final pacification of England in 1071 and the invasion and intimidation of Scotland in 1072, as well as learning how to be a statesman by witnessing all royal charters issued from 1074 until 1083. But even as a soldier, William soon learned that a king could not entirely forget about the church. In 1077, he attended two major religious ceremonies with his parents and his older brother Robert, one which consecrated the new cathedral at Bayeux, built by his uncle Odo of Bayeux on the 14th of July, and another on the 13th of September, which marked the dedication of St. Stephen's at Caen. In addition to the church, William also had a strained relationship with his unruly older brother Robert, as a story told by the Order Vitalis illustrates. In 1078, when Robert was 25, William was 18, and Henry was 10 years old, the brothers were with their father, who was preparing to attack one of the adjoining regions at L'Aigle, situated on the southeast frontier of Normandy. William and Henry were staying at the house of a merchant called Gunher, and their brother, being the most senior, was lodged at his own quarters elsewhere. One evening, the two younger brothers decided to pay their older brother a visit, going around to his lodgings to play several rounds of dice to pass the time. During the game, an argument ensued, and in response, William and Henry urinated on the heads of Robert and his comrades. The two mischievous brothers ran away downstairs from the enraged Robert, who chased them and began beating them up so severely that the king had to be called in to stop the fight and to force them to make up and apologize. Robert, being extremely embarrassed by the incident, sought to reclaim his honor, leaving his base at L'Aigle with a regiment of men and attempting to capture his father's fortress at Rouen, about 1 day's march away. William the Conqueror issued a warrant for the arrest of his wayward son, who fled Normandy, and for the next year led the life of an aristocratic bandit on the run from the authorities. In 1079, William the Conqueror and William Rufus were both injured while trying to seize the fortified settlement of Gerberoy from the hands of Robert, who had illegally occupied the town and refused to give it back. As a result of Robert's insolence, he was disinherited from the throne by his father William in favour of William Rufus, who was consecrated as heir instead. In 1080, Robert, seeking to make amends for his bad behaviour, rode to his father's court at Rouen and seemingly apologised to both his father and brother for the distress and injury he had caused. As a result, it was announced that Robert, now back in the good books, was the heir to Normandy, which he was to govern alongside the county of Maine after his father's death. Next, William Rufus went to England in order to defend the realm against the incursions of Malcolm Canmore, King of the Scots, who had launched a campaign against the northern regions. Their relationship being somewhat repaired, William Rufus fought alongside Robert and their father William the Conqueror during their successful counterattack, which took them into the heart of Scottish territory as far as Lothian and St. David's. After their success against the Scots, William, Robert and their father rode with an army to South Wales to put down a revolt in 1081, before going to Maine to crush an invasion by Fulkers of Anjou, launching a devastating counter-sortie into Anjou itself and brokering the peace of Blancheland to reaffirm Robert's overlordship of Maine. In 1082, William Rufus again stood firmly by his father's side after the arrest of his half-brother, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux and Earl of Kent, who was thrown into jail for reasons that are, still today, entirely unclear. It has been suggested that Odo, one of William the Conqueror's most trusted lieutenants, was incarcerated with the help of the cleric Lanfranc on charges of desertion because he was raising an army in order to go to Italy and install himself as Pope. Following this debacle, William and his family received devastating news on the 2nd of November, 1083, regarding Matilda, who had always been Robert's greatest supporter at the royal court, even when he was at odds with it. Matilda had died, compelling the senior sibling to leave that same year to find adventure and fortune outside the confines of the Norman realm. As Robert gallivanted around Flanders, Germany, Aquitaine, Gascony, and even Italy to ask for the hand of Matilda of Tuscany, a noblewoman of the highest pedigree and beauty, William Rufus, the ever-faithful son, stood steadfastly by his father's side throughout the early to mid-1080s until the Conqueror's death. In 1085, he was with his father as he prepared a military force to defend against a possible Danish invasion. At Christmas that same year, he is reported to have been in the presence of the king when he issued the Domesday Book from his court at Gloucester. In 1086, he attended the wedding of his sister Constance, who married Count Alan Fergant of Brittany. In 1087, as a paid retainer of the king, William Rufus also followed his father to the Vexin, a disputed borderland between Normandy and France, which was to be the Conqueror's last campaign. Later that year, William the Conqueror lay on his deathbed at Rouen for 5 weeks after being severely injured in an attack on the French town of Mantes. Facing his end, William was persuaded by his courtiers to reinstate Robert as heir to the throne in the tradition of primogeniture, in which the eldest son acquired all of his father's titles and possessions, despite Robert abandoning the realm. In 1083, and the difficult relationship he had always had with his firstborn, William was convinced by their arguments in favour of Robert, who was still on his adventures abroad and hadn't returned, but made arrangements to bequeath to William Rufus a sizable inheritance in recognition of his unwavering loyalty by sending him to England on September 8th with a letter for Lanfranc, now Archbishop of Canterbury, alongside several English hostages and possibly the royal insignia, which was to be given to Robert. Yet Rufus had other plans in mind. With a small entourage, Rufus sailed to the Hampshire or Sussex coast from Touques and arrived at Winchester to claim the royal treasures. 2 weeks later, on the 26th of September, William Rufus, now 27 years old, was crowned as the new King of England by Lanfranc, now Archbishop of Canterbury, at Westminster Abbey, who had decided to disobey William the Conqueror's last wishes to the anger of Robert Curthose, who would soon make his feelings known. Although William was fairly inexperienced in government, with the support of the powerful Lanfranc, He soon established his authority over the royal administration and the various nobles that swore fealty to the crown. As soon as Robert heard about his father's passing, he returned home and was reaffirmed by the church and the baronage as Duke of Normandy and Count of Maine. Robert was furious that his position had been undermined, but instead of leaping into action immediately, he decided rather unwisely to wait for the members of the royal court to expel the usurper of his throne. Yet this was to prove impossible, as William Rufus, appointing the astute Bishop of Durham, William of St. Calais, as his principal advisor, smartly reinforced his rule by bestowing a large portion of the empire's wealth to the counties and to the church. Here, William was following the last wishes of his father, who had requested his treasures be distributed to the monasteries and churches of his realm for the salvation of his soul in the afterlife. Over the years, the Conqueror had amassed a considerable treasure trove of the most precious objects, the majority of which had rather ironically been looted from the churches he was now desperate to posthumously please. In accordance with his father's instructions, William gave to the ministers 10 marks of gold and a selection of stolen church valuables, to the country churches 6 marks, and to every shire in the land £100 to help the poor. Within a short space of time, William had further entrenched his power, and his tenure garnered widespread support from the church as well as the landed aristocracy. This was no doubt facilitated by the good relationship that William Rufus had enjoyed with his father, and in extension, his father's friends and confidants, the majority of whom kept their positions instead of being ousted immediately, as would have been the case if the estranged Robert had become king. A great sense of continuation thus accompanied the reigns of William the Conqueror and William Rufus, with the new king even using the same iconography of his father on the royal seal, the only change being the name it bore. However, William also gave back all the lands and titles of Odo of Bayeux, in a move the young monarch would soon regret, for his treacherous half-uncle, who had been imprisoned for several months by William the Conqueror for dereliction of duty, was unhappy with the new status quo. Odo, now reinstated as Earl of Kent, began to plot the downfall of the new king almost immediately, with the support of his brother Robert, Count of Mortain, Henry, William Rufus's younger brother, and other major landowners, including Roger de Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, and Geoffrey, Bishop of Coutances, to install Robert Curthose, William's estranged brother, as king. Odo preferred Robert, as despite regaining his titles and honours, he saw no future for himself in William's new administration, as he saw the young king sideline him in favour of William of St. Calais, a man who had once embarrassingly been his protégé. Another of William's favourites that he also had a grudge against was Archbishop Lanfranc, a man who had been largely responsible for his brief imprisonment in 1082 after his attempt to assemble an army to take the papal seat in Italy. In the spring of 1088, the conspirators began to strengthen their castles at Rochester, Tunbridge, and Pevensey in England in preparation for an invasion force led by Robert in 1066, except this time it was for the purpose of civil war rather than conquest. Before Robert arrived, small revolts had begun to erupt throughout the empire in East Anglia and the Welsh Marches. Eustace, Count of Boulogne, along with 3 sons of Roger de Montgomery, had already been sent to England to act as an advance party for the invasion. However, by July 1088, William Rufus foiled the rebellion by preemptively capturing the castles at Tunbridge, Pevensey, and Rochester, taking prisoner all of the rebellion's main leaders in the process. In an effort to win back their goodwill, William Rufus treated the majority of Robert's co-collaborators with forgiveness, allowing them to keep their titles and wealth despite being traitors, and reserved his anger only for a select few. The architect of the conspiracy, Odo of Bayeux, was disinherited yet again and exiled, while Henry, William's younger brother, who had sailed with Robert's invasion force and asked William for lands he claimed had been bequeathed to him by their mother, had his request ignored by his older sibling. The last person William dealt with was William of St. Calais, his erstwhile ally and advisor, who had deserted the royal army in March 1088 and returned to his holy see in Durham in an act that was considered the highest of treasons. On the 2nd of November, after being granted safe conduct to Salisbury to answer for his crimes, the king, with the support of his trusted friend, Archbishop Lanfranc, requested that William of St. Calais be charged under feudal law as a baron of the realm. William of St. Calais, however, refused, and instead asked to be tried under church law, angering Rufus to such a degree that he is reported to have said in the stutter that always surfaced when the king was in a temper, "By the face of Lucca, you'll never escape from my hands before I have your castle. Believe me, Bishop, you're not going back to Durham, and your men are not going to stay at Durham, and you're not going free until you release the castle." The bishop relented, but he was permitted to cross the sea and become the chief advisor to Robert, who remained Duke of Normandy and Count of Maine despite the attempted coup. William Rufus further strengthened his position by rewarding his followers for their loyalty, bestowing titles on Robert Fitzhyman, who was given the honour of Gloucester, Henry de Beaumont, who was made Earl of Warwick, Simon de Senlis, who was invested as the new Earl of Huntingdon and Northampton, and Walter Gifford, who was inserted as the new Earl of Buckingham. William's staunchest ally, Archbishop Lanfranc, who had been a notable presence in William's life ever since he was 5 years old, and a man who had acted faithfully as a mentor and later an advisor, died the next year on the 28th of May 1089. Although William grieved for him, the Archbishop's death signified the end of his influence on William's power, which now became stronger than ever, while also marking the start of his growing rift with the Church. After the failed invasion of 1088, the relationship between William and his brother Robert remained uneasy. Over the next few years, William used his financial resources to undermine their eldest brother by lining the pockets of Robert's vassals with gold in order to ensure their support in the event that he had to invade Normandy. At this point in time, William still enjoyed the full backing of the Church, whereas the nobility in general were still unsure if he was the right man for the job, with many of them preferring to wait it out and make a firmer decision pending future developments. Nevertheless, by 1090, William Rufus's reign was secured by alliances with a significant number of nobles in Upper Normandy, but his brother Henry, ever ambitious to prove himself to his older siblings, was now causing trouble. He wished to make the territories of Avranchin and Cotentin, which he had purchased in 1087 for £3,000 from Robert, into an independent kingdom. At the same time, Robert's Duchy of Normandy had fallen into ruin, compelling some of Rufus's allies to start a rebellion in Rouen, which was only ended after the intervention of Henry, who saw it in his interest at the time to help out Robert. In an effort to stabilise the region, William personally made his way to Normandy in February 1091 and set up a base at Eu in order to undermine Robert. However, thanks to the intervention of William of St. Calais, William's former advisor and Robert's current counsellor, the two brothers agreed to put aside their differences and agree to the Peace of Rouen, in which William was delegated the county of Eu, the abbey of Fécamp, and the town of Cherbourg for his own allies to administrate. In return, Robert was given a large amount of money, a couple of estates in England, and most importantly, the military might of William's armies, who were to help him recover his lost territories from some of the rebellious independent lords, seeking to stake their claim. In another conciliatory measure, all of Robert's dukes and noblemen who had supported his failed coup were handed back all of the privileges that had been stripped from them. In a move that angered the young Henry considerably, both William and Robert agreed that each was to be their heir, assuming all property and titles in the event of death. In his rage, Henry forcibly seized the town of Mont St. Michael, which was besieged by William and Robert, who were merciful enough to eventually let Henry and his men leave unharmed. It was during this conflict that the king showed himself to be a man of the highest bravery. After spotting a party of Henry's soldiers riding past his camp in a disrespectful manner, William became so enraged that he leapt onto the most expensive horse in his collection and single-handedly rushed towards them with such enthusiasm that he was brought down and dragged along the ground with a foot stuck in his stirrup. With the cavalryman about to strike him down with a sword, William suddenly shouted, "Stop, you fool! I'm the King of England!" Realizing the true identity of the felled man, Henry's knights immediately provided him with a fresh horse. William asked which of them had taken him down, the responsible soldier replying, "It was me, but I didn't know you were the king. I thought you were only a knight." William was sufficiently tickled by the response, responding with sudden warmth, "By the face of Lucca, from now on you'll be my man, and in my service get a proper reward for your courage and spirit." Afterwards, Henry roamed France for a while, until in February 1092 he took the town of Domfront, located on the southern frontiers of Normandy, displacing one of the most renowned border princes of his day, Robert de Bellême. With the disowned Henry out of the picture, William started strengthening Robert's languishing duchy, laying out the groundwork for further consolidation with a provincial synod held by the Archbishop of Rouen in June 1091, and an investigation into the judicial rights their father, William the Conqueror, had been able to exercise in the region. On the other hand, trouble was brewing back in Britain, with a resurgent Malcolm Canmore of Scotland invading England again, at the same time as civil strife was erupting in Wales. The brotherly duo first dealt with the Welsh before moving on to crush Malcolm's foray with a devastating counterattack from Scotland, which saw the brothers mobilise a fleet up the east coast, land an army on its eastern shores, and make their way back to England with a devastating raid, forcing Malcolm to send out one of his representatives, Edgar, to hash out the terms of a peace truce with Robert. It was decided that Malcolm would resume the relationship he had had before with William the Conqueror, which involved swearing fealty to the English in return for some English borderlands held prior to 1087 and a hefty annual grant paid directly into Scottish coffers. Shortly after the peace agreement, Duncan, the eldest son of Malcolm Canmore, accompanied William to the south of England as a sign of their renewed friendship. With affairs in Britain in order, a new argument arose between the two brothers, for William seemed reluctant to return to Normandy and help out Robert and give him the promised English seats as agreed, compelling the English monarch to sail from the Isle of Wight to Normandy during Christmas of 1091 to address his brother's concerns. Here, nothing was achieved, and in a sign of the growing rift between them, one that had seemed to be healing, William did not visit Normandy again until 1094, and Robert would not travel to England again until 1101. In this period, it seemed William was more concerned with fixing his own problems in England. In May 1092, he embarked on a campaign to displace the Scottish installed ruler of Cumbria, Dolphin, by sending a fleet on the western sea route to attack it from the coast, which successfully expelled Malcolm's representative and led to the reinstallation of Carlisle as an English fief. By doing this, William restored the traditional border that delineated England from Scotland, and after Malcolm's death in 1093, he was able to expand further into Scotland towards Liddell and the Tweed through a series of alliances and the seizure of several settlements. Yet William's historic advance would be halted in its tracks after the king fell seriously ill while patrolling the Welsh marches in March 1093, remaining in a state of grave health throughout the whole of the Lent period at Gloucester. For William, it seemed obvious that God was punishing him for his misdeeds and the mistakes of his administration. As the sickly monarch fell deeper into the grips of disease, he made a full confession to Anselm, abbot of Bec, pledging that if he should live, he would carry out a multitude of reforms to strengthen the realm. More immediately, William released all of his prisoners and forgave all of their debts, installed Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury after the see had lain unoccupied for several years, an insult that had riled the church considerably, and bestowed gifts and donations to monasteries all over the country. Close to death, William was perhaps realizing how disrespectful and exploitative his policies had been towards the church, such as selling monasteries and abbeys to his followers, camouflaged as gifts and donations, and purposely leaving church property unoccupied in order to collect its revenues. Although the installation of a new Archbishop of Canterbury suggested William was changing tack, he never did, and Anselm, champion of the church, would become one of William's greatest opponents. At court in the following years, a holy man who despised William's treatment of the church so much that later he would impose 4 years of penance on himself for the crime of serving under him. From November 1097, spending the rest of William's reign as far away as possible from his heretical lord, either in Italy at the Vatican City or in France at the Sea of Lions. Yet for the time being, William sent out further glimmers of hope that he was a reformed Christian man, promising to finally take a wife and to produce heirs. Yet these were to be quickly dashed by the hesitancy he displayed when he was given the chance to marry over the summer of 1093 after his recovery. That summer, on a visit to Wilton Abbey, Rufus had been matched with Matilda, the daughter of Malcolm Canmore and his wife Margaret, in a matrimony that would have strengthened the bonds between England and Scotland. However, the abbess presiding over her education, in an effort to save her from wedlock, supposedly disguised Matilda as a nun, so that when Rufus entered, he found her hidden under the veils, compelling him to leave the church. Malcolm was so enraged at what had happened that he returned there a week later, destroyed her veils, and took her back to Scotland with him. William's apparent rejection of Matilda led Malcolm to invade England for a fifth time, and it was during this campaign that Malcolm himself was killed during an ambush on the 13th of November 1093 by Robert Mowbray, the Earl of Northumbria. But still afterwards, William would remain wifeless, and Matilda was instead wed to his younger brother Henry later on in 1100. Meanwhile, with Malcolm Canmore no longer troubling the realm, William turned his attention to his brother Robert, again, who was growing increasingly frustrated that his brother, who had been distracted by his conflict with Scotland, was not carrying out the terms of the Treaty of Rouen, which stipulated that he was to provide aid. Robert had already been forced to act himself, reigniting his friendship with the Count of Flanders and keeping his overlordship of the territory of Guillaume, Count of Eu, whose duchy had been promised to William. Yet William made little effort to address his brother's grievances. At Christmas 1093, Robert became so incensed at his brother's unwillingness to cooperate that he gave him an ultimatum, stating that unless he fulfilled the obligation of the Treaty of Rouen, or convinced him of the necessity of the long delay, he would consider the agreement void. However, before he could arrange a parley with Robert, William would first have to deal with his bothersome Archbishop Anselm, who requested in February 1094 to convene a church council to answer rumours of sodomy and incest plaguing the king's administration, as well as to inquire about William's persistent practice of leaving the church's abbeys unoccupied, an appeal to which Rufus scathingly refused and supposedly shouted, "What business is it of yours? Aren't they my abbeys? You do what you like with your manors. Why can't I do what I want with my abbeys? Your predecessor, Lanfranc, would never have dared speak in this way to my father, and I will do nothing at all for you." His archbishop sufficiently put in his place, William next travelled to Normandy to meet with his brother, sailing across the English Channel on the 19th of March 1094. The meeting was a disaster, as the guarantors of the treaty, alongside Robert, put the blame squarely on William for failing to meet its terms. With his own king and brother seemingly deserting him, Robert enlisted the support of King Philip II of France, at the same time that William recalled his younger sibling Henry from his duchy at Domfront to make raids from their base at Eu. Perhaps in recognition that he had let his older brother down, William continued campaigns to reclaim the Duchy of Normandy back, but by January 1095 he had little to show for his efforts, which had taken the lives of an enormous number of his men. When William returned, he found England in a state of disarray, with trouble breaking out once again in Wales, where a number of his subjects had revolted against Norman rule. Even worse, he unearthed another plot to overthrow him, this time led by his baron Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumberland, who wished to replace him not with Robert Curthose, but one of his cousins, Stephen of Aumale, the son of one of the main conspirators, Odo of Champagne. Indeed, some of the barons disliked William immensely, as like the church he bled them dry, forcing heirs to repurchase their entire estates on the death of its lord instead of paying a small relief payment, insisting that they pay him for permission to marry their daughters and other female family members, and legally requiring the widows of barons to remarry, were among some of the more duplicitous schemes that enraged and alienated a large proportion of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. In the summer, William set out with an army to the north to Durham to re-establish his authority, from where he captured the castle on the Tyne before besieging the fortress at Bamburgh. Next, William had to rush back down to Wales to help out the Earl of Shrewsbury, who had been unable to defend Montgomery, which had been taken by Welsh revolutionaries. The presence of the king and the gathering of a great army in Snowdonia proved sufficient for the Welsh to give up. Soon after, the baronial rebellion ran out of steam after its architect, Robert de Mowbray, fled from Bamburgh Castle and was captured at the monastery situated at Tynemouth. Mowbray was dragged out and incarcerated at Windsor, found guilty of treason in January 1096, and kept prisoner for the rest of his life. As for the other conspirators, and in stark contrast to his benevolent treatment of those responsible for the revolt of 1088, William Rufus punished them brutally, blinding and castrating Guillaume, Count of Eu, so horrifically that he died of his injuries, hanging the Count's steward and mutilating, fining, and exiling several others. On the 27th of November, 1096, as William was putting down the last remnants of the conspirators in Northumbria, Pope Urban II made his iconic speech at Clermont, proposing that a Christian army should take back Jerusalem and extinguish its Muslim occupiers. After years of being undermined by his brother William, Robert Curthose answered the Pope's call, becoming one of the major commanders of the First Crusade after pledging allegiance to the cross in February 1096. At the cost of 10,000 marks, which was less than a quarter of his annual royal income, it was agreed that William would oversee Robert's duchy for a total of 3 years while he fought the Saracens in the Holy Land. In addition to this, Henry, who had become less headstrong with age, was finally deemed trustworthy enough to oversee the counties of Coutances and Bayeux, and the town of Caen, which significantly enlarged his holdings. In September 1096, with all his affairs in order, Robert Curthose left his ancestral home of Normandy for the vast plains of the Middle East, where he was to achieve unimaginable glory for his role in the capture of Jerusalem in July 1099, the greatest Christian victory of the Middle Ages, while William resolutely held the Norman realm together for the next couple of years. After Rufus had obtained Robert's duchies, he started spending significantly more time in Normandy than before, his longest stay lasting a year and 5 months, illustrating that with Robert's absence, he clearly felt far more comfortable there. Rufus's first task at hand was to restore the boundaries carved out by his forebear William the Conqueror that had been somewhat disrupted by the neighbouring King of France, an undertaking made easier since he enjoyed the almost universal support of the Norman barons at this moment in time. Battling against Louis, who was later crowned Louis VI, Rufus attempted to take the fortresses of Chaumont, Pontoise and Montet by force in 2 offensives between 1097 and 1099. Yet despite having the support of Henry and many other respected soldiers such as Robert de Bellême and even a French baron, Guillaume, Count of Poitou, and the Duke of Aquitaine, who had no doubt heard of William's burgeoning reputation as a man who rewarded his allies well, the Anglo-Normans were unable to capture any of the castles, with the establishment of a stronghold at Gisors on the river Epte, which was to remain a key border fort until Normandy was taken from King John in 1204, his only notable accomplishment during this campaign. Another of William Rufus's priorities was to restore the Duchy of Maine and to replace Hélias de la Flèche, whose family were illegally occupying the seat. The campaign started successfully after one of his followers, Robert de Bellême, was able to ambush and apprehend Hélias in April 1098 before handing him over to William. William's next aim was to take back the city of Le Mans, which was still in the custody of one of Hélias's accomplices, Folques, Count of Anjou, who was part of the Angevin family, historically the nemesis of William's bloodline. Marching south with an enormous army at his back, Folques was persuaded by members of the Norman nobility and the church to lay down his arms, leading to a peace agreement which stipulated that William was to receive all of the settlements that William the Conqueror had possessed previously, and that all prisoners should be returned. When Rufus entered Le Mans that summer, having proudly restored his father's empire, he passed a series of laws and decrees, and also decided to release Hélias de la Flèche from custody, stating for the record that he did not recognize him as Count of Maine. In an exchange recorded by the chronicler, William of Malmesbury, William rebuked Hélias with his customary flamboyance. "Do you think I care what you would do? Get out. Clear off. You can do whatever you want. And by the face of Lucca, if next time you're the winner, I shan't be asking you for something in return for this." After a long time away at the frontiers of his kingdom on campaign, William finally made his way back to England in Easter of 1099, where he held an extravagant court at Westminster. This court saw Edgar, King of the Scots, who had taken the place of the irrepressible Malcolm Canmore, pay homage to him by carrying the sword of the state. In a ceremony designed to reinforce his authority on the throne, William was crowned yet again, a function that was finished off by a grand feast. However, William's stay was cut short with the re-emergence of more trouble on the continent. Hélias de la Flèche had again disobeyed the king's orders and recaptured Le Mans, and William was forced to cut his hunting trip in June short to deal with it. It is reported that upon hearing the news, William turned his horse around immediately and set off for the coast, commandeering a ship of a sailor who was ordered to depart despite there being a great storm. The captain himself supposedly joked that he had never heard of a king being lost to the sea, and that he himself would order the wind and the waves to deliver him safely across the channel, to which the monarch is said to have quipped that his men would follow him even through raging seas. With the Norman garrison holding on to a few remaining fortifications, having burnt down the majority of Le Mans in a desperate defensive measure, they were finally relieved with the arrival of their king, who promptly started to pursue Hélias de la Flèche around the county of Maine. After failing to take the castle at Mayet, in which he was nearly killed by a stone thrown from its parapets, and also failing to capture Hélias, who was able to slip from his grasp, Rufus chose to dole out punishment instead by ravaging the countryside, ordering the disassembling of the uncompleted Cathedral of Le Mans, and imprisoning its bishop-poet, Hildebert, who later would write several scathing verses about William. Rufus, denouncing him as a man so dishonest he was the equal to Fortune herself, who disobeyed all masters, and also that he was guilty of all of the most evil vices. In the autumn of 1099, William Rufus prepared for the return of Robert, who had distinguished himself as a Christian hero during the First Crusade, and was returning with his new Italian bride Sybil, the daughter of Geoffrey of Conversano, the Lord of Brindisi in Apulia, who had gifted Robert an enormous dowry that he intended to use to shore up his position back in Normandy. With Robert wintering with his new spouse in Sicily, Rufus took the unusual step of staying in England with his brother Henry to hunt game, at a time when it was more politically beneficial for him to establish his presence in Normandy. Before Robert arrived back in order to strengthen his hand in the inevitable negotiations, for at the time, William was still in control of Robert's lands. However, it wouldn't matter anyway, for the meeting of the two brothers would never happen after an unfortunate and to some suspicious accident that was to happen as Robert was en route back to the Anglo-Norman kingdom. On Thursday, the 2nd of August 1100, William Rufus was at Brockenhurst in the New Forest, preparing for an action-packed day of hunting, his favourite pastime, at the royal hunting grounds he had enlarged for himself in an unpopular decree some years previously. Rufus would customarily start the day's proceedings in the morning, but on this particular day he broke with tradition and decided it was better for his royal party, which included Henry and several other esteemed nobles, to begin in the afternoon. The royal company divided themselves up into smaller groups, with each taking position in the forest at assigned spots, where they would wait for deer, disturbed by a beta team to run into their sights. William, who always treated his friends with generosity and honour, was accompanied by one of his best warriors, Walter Tyrrell, Count of Poix, who, like his liege lord, was excited for the day's hunt. Where William stood on that day is still disputed. Some believe it was at a spot just outside the lost village of Thruham, whereas others affirm that he was in Stricknage Wood, at the exact location of the Rufus Stone, a monument erected in 1745, said to mark the exact spot where William fell. It was during one of those hunting drives that day that William died instantly after being pierced in the heart by an arrow from one of his own men, in an incident initially thought to have been a terrible hunting accident, a rather common occurrence. At the time, that had also claimed the lives of William's brother Richard, and, more recently, his nephew of the same name, who was one of Robert's bastard sons. However, conflicting accounts of what happened that day further muddied the waters. Later chroniclers, such as William of Malmesbury, attributed the shot to Walter Tyrrell, yet Abbot Suger of St. Denis, writing in his biography of Louis VI, claimed that Walter of Tyrrell always swore on the most serious of oaths that he was not even with the king that day, and that he was part of another group that didn't even see him. Where the sources do agree, though, is that the unfortunate shot was a representation of God's vengeance against a man whose reign had always been dogged with uncomfortable accusations of blasphemy, sin, and vice. Later, historians have questioned if it was indeed an accident and have entertained the notion that it was, in fact, an act of premeditated murder organized by none other than Henry himself, who, after hearing the news of his brother's passing, rushed to Winchester to secure the royal treasury and was crowned king by the Bishop of London on Sunday, the 5th of August, a mere 3 days later. Henry moved so quickly that he was unable to attend William Rufus's funeral on the Friday, a drab affair suspiciously lacking in the pomp and splendour usually reserved for a king. In fact, it seems that Rufus was quickly forgotten about, his body being transported by a wagon by low-level servants to Winchester, where he was entombed the next morning at the Old Minster, at the centre of the choir underneath the tower, with hardly a distinguished nobleman in attendance. Of course, William's death could just as easily have been an accident, for no conclusive proof exists of a conspiracy to prematurely remove him from office. But what is for sure is that his untimely passing still remains one of the most mysterious events in British history, and one that will still be talked about for generations to come. Although the reign of William Rufus was short, the documents and accounts left behind tell the story of a man with a unique sort of charisma, a king who could be equally as upset by a pair of cheap shoes as he could by a rebellion to oust him from the throne. Although his fondness for exuberance, glamour and style, coupled with the large collection of remarkable outbursts attributed to him as direct quotes compiled by later scholars, paint him as an almost absurd character, a stroppy, fiery sovereign who threw fits of anger when he did not get his way. His abilities as a leader should not be understated or ignored. During his reign, William effectively dealt with two plots to overthrow him, one in 1088 led by Odo of Bayeux and his brother Robert, and another in 1096, organised by his own baron, Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumberland. As well as being able to maintain a strong grip on power, William, ever the warrior and despiser of the church, an institution he was more than happy to leave for the battlefield after a traumatic childhood experience as a student of Lanfranc, was an accomplished soldier in his own right, having been trained under the watchful eye from an early age in the art of warfare by one of the best instructors, William the Conqueror, a father to whom he remained a loyal and devoted son until the end, a truth that even his detractors had to admit was one of his best qualities and which can be seen in the remarkable continuity of his government. William also fought valiantly alongside the Conqueror in his later years as he sought to pacify for good his English and Norman realms, and as a king, he was able to impose his authority on his own belligerent kinsmen and the French, who were constantly looking to upset the balance of power in Normandy, as well as effectively protecting the northern reaches of his empire from the incursions of the Scots. Although William was thoroughly disliked by the church and a section of the barony for his exploitative economic practices, today William is generally thought of as having been a generous king, especially to his friends, an effective maintainer of the realm, and a loyal son. He was largely preferred by many to his more independently minded brother Robert, a wildcard with whom he always had a difficult relationship, likely exacerbated by that fateful day in 1078 when he and his brother Henry pulled what seemed like a harmless practical joke that sent him over the edge. William's relationship with his brother Henry, who could be a friend or a foe of his depending on the situation, was a lot more unclear and made even murkier by the suspicious circumstances of his death in a hunting accident, in which some believe Henry, who ultimately became king as a result, was responsible. Welcome back, sweet dreamer. This concludes part 1 of our tranquil journey through the Norman dynasty. We've witnessed the remarkable conquest of England by William the Conqueror and followed the enigmatic reign of his son, William Rufus, whose mysterious death in the New Forest would change the course of English history. Tomorrow night, we'll continue this peaceful tale in part 2, beginning with the unlikely ascension of Henry I, the youngest prince who would become England's most accomplished Norman king, and gently arriving at the chaotic era of King Stephen and the anarchy, a time when civil war would tear the realm apart. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which Norman ruler intrigued you most, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of medieval England to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers.